The iron is cold against her throat. Berenice is 29 years old, and she can feel the weight of the collar pressing against her windpipe with every breath. Can taste the rust and old blood that clings to metal that has circled 100 necks before hers. She was, until 17 days ago, Queen of Cappadocia, ruler of a kingdom that had stood independent for 3 centuries, commander of an army that had defied Rome for 7 years. She was the woman who had looked Emperor Tiberius's legate in the eye and told him that Cappadocia would burn before it bowed. Now she kneels on stone floors in a Roman camp, her wrists chained behind her back, her hair shorn to stubble because long hair on a captive queen is considered a weapon. Something she might use to strangle herself before Rome can display her properly. Around her, she can hear the sounds of a military camp at dawn. Orders barked in Latin, horses being led to water, the clatter of equipment being packed for the long march west, the march to Rome, the march to the triumph. The cell smells of urine and old straw and something else underneath, something sweet and rotting that she has learned not to think about. The previous occupant of this cell did not survive long enough to be moved. They dragged the body out 3 days ago, but the smell remains, a reminder of what happens to captives who stop being useful. A guard watches from outside the iron bars. His eyes move over her body with an assessment she has become familiar with over the past 17 days, the calculation that Roman soldiers perform when examining captured women. Not lust, exactly. Something colder. An evaluation of function, of use, of what purposes she might serve during the months before the triumph, and what condition she needs to be in when she finally walks in chains through the streets of Rome. She is beginning to understand that the triumph itself is not the punishment. The triumph is merely the finale. What happens before the triumph, during the months of captivity and preparation, during the long journey from the edges of empire to its heart, that is where the real punishment occurs. The triumph is public humiliation, lasting a single day. What precedes it is systematic destruction lasting as long as Rome requires. A man approaches the cell. He is perhaps 45 years old, wearing the armor of a senior officer, his face bearing the particular expression of bored cruelty that Berenice has learned to recognize in Roman military professionals. He does not introduce himself. He does not need to. The guards snap to attention when he approaches, and that tells her everything about his rank. "You are the Cappadocian," he says. It is not a question. "The one who killed the legate's nephew at the Battle of Mazacca." "I gave the order," Berenice replies. Her voice comes out steadier than she expected. "My archers carried it out. He died bravely, if that matters to Rome. It does not." The officer studies her through the bars with the same assessing gaze the guards have been applying. "What matters to Rome is that you will walk in Germanicus's triumph 8 months from now. What matters to Rome is that you will be displayed as proof of Roman victory, evidence that even queens who defy the legions are eventually brought to heel. What matters to Rome is what happens to you between now and then. 8 months. The words settle into Berenice's mind with physical weight. 8 months of captivity before she is paraded through Rome and then disposed of. 8 months of being whatever Rome decides she should be. "What happens to me between now and then?" she asks. The officer smiles. It is not a pleasant expression. "You will be prepared," he says. "Prepared for the triumph. Prepared to perform your role properly. This preparation takes many forms. Some of them you will find educational. Some of them you will find less so." He gestures to the guard, who unlocks the cell door and steps inside. The guard grabs Berenice's arm and hauls her to her feet, his grip hard enough to leave bruises. "The general wishes to see you," the officer says. "He has specific plans for the Cappadocian queen. You should feel honored. Most captives are processed through standard procedures. You have attracted personal attention. Personal attention. The words carry weight that Berenice does not yet fully understand, but that makes the guard's grip on her arms seem almost gentle by comparison. She is led from the cell into morning light that hurts her eyes after days of darkness, through the ordered chaos of a Roman military camp, preparing for movement, past soldiers who stop their work to stare at her, past other captives chained in lines awaiting transport, past wagons loaded with the wealth of her conquered kingdom. She sees her crown in one of those wagons, the diadem she wore when she addressed her people, when she led her army, when she believed that courage and determination could hold back the greatest military power the world had ever known. It sits in a pile of other treasures, gold and silver and jewels stripped from her palace, from her temples, from the bodies of her nobles who died defending what was theirs. She does not cry. She has learned already that tears accomplish nothing and reveal weakness that Romans will exploit. But she memorizes the wagon's position. She memorizes the faces of the soldiers guarding it. She memorizes everything, because information is the only weapon she has left, and she intends to use it. What you are about to learn has been systematically sanitized from the histories that celebrate Roman triumph as glorious spectacle. The poets who described golden chariots and cheering crowds chose not to examine what happened in the camps and prisons and ships where captured royalty spent the months before their public display. The historians who praised Roman military achievement preferred not to document the specific methods used to transform proud monarchs into broken prisoners suitable for parading. Tonight, you will learn what the triumph actually required. Not the single day of public celebration that the textbooks describe, but the months of preparation that preceded it. You will learn what Roman soldiers did to captured queens, kings, and princes during the long period between capture and display. You will learn why some royal captives arrived in Rome already destroyed, while others were kept in conditions that preserved their appearance while shattering everything else. You will learn about the officials whose job it was to manage royal prisoners, the specialists in what Rome called preparation, who understood exactly how to break a monarch's spirit without breaking their body. You will learn about the hierarchy of captives, why some were destined for execution after the triumph, while others were permitted to survive, and what determined which fate a prisoner received. You will learn about the specific practices that sources describe only in euphemisms, the hospitality that officers provided to their most important prisoners, the entertainment that royal captives were expected to provide during the journey to Rome. You will learn what happened to the women and children of conquered royal families, why daughters were sometimes more valuable than sons, and what purposes Rome found for royalty, too young to pose a political threat. You will learn why Cleopatra chose suicide over allowing herself to be taken to Rome, why she understood that death was preferable to what awaited her in Octavian's triumph. You will learn what happened to the royal captives, who did not have Cleopatra's opportunity to escape, who were forced to experience what she avoided through the asp's venom. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness behind Rome's most celebrated ritual. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Berenice is being led through that camp right now, toward a general who has specific plans for her, toward 8 months of preparation that will test everything she is, and I am going to tell you exactly what those plans were. But before I reveal what the Romans did to Berenice and the other captured queens who walked in their triumphs, I need to take you back. I need to show you how the triumph functioned, why it required what it required, and what made the capture of royalty so valuable to Roman generals seeking glory. Because you cannot understand what happened to Berenice without understanding the system that processed her. The Roman triumph was not merely a parade. It was a religious ceremony, a political statement, and a psychological weapon all combined into a single overwhelming spectacle. A general who celebrated a triumph was, for that single day, something approaching a god, his face painted red like Jupiter's statue, his person considered sacred, his achievements proclaimed to the entire Roman world. But triumphs were not granted easily. They required specific qualifications that the Senate enforced with increasing strictness as Rome's power grew. A general seeking a triumph needed to have held proper command authority. He needed to have killed at least 5,000 enemies in a single battle. He needed to have expanded Roman territory or achieved a significant strategic victory. And he needed captives. Not just any captives. Common prisoners of war could be sold as slaves, distributed as rewards to soldiers, disposed of in whatever manner seemed convenient. But a triumph required special captives, visible proof of Roman dominance over peoples who had dared to resist. The higher the status of the captive, the greater the glory reflected on the general who had captured them. A captured general was valuable. A captured king was more valuable. A captured queen, walking in chains through the streets of Rome, her royal dignity reduced to public spectacle, her body displayed as proof that Roman power respected no status and recognized no limit that was the ultimate trophy. This created specific incentives in how royal captives were treated. They needed to survive until the triumph. They needed to be recognizable as royalty, their status visible to the crowds who would judge the general's achievement. They needed to be broken enough to walk in chains without resisting, without attempting escape or suicide, without doing anything that might disrupt the carefully choreographed display. But they also needed to be accessible to those who had captured them. Roman officers who had risked their lives conquering distant kingdoms believed they had earned certain rewards. The general who would celebrate the triumph believed he had earned the right to sample his trophies before displaying them publicly. The soldiers who had fought and bled for Rome believed they deserved compensation for their sacrifices. These beliefs shaped everything that happened to royal captives between capture and triumph. The system that processed them was not random cruelty. It was organized, methodical, refined over generations of Roman conquest. Specific officials were responsible for different aspects of captive management. Specific protocols governed who had access to which prisoners, when, and for what purposes. Specific hierarchies determined which captives were reserved for the general's personal use and which could be distributed among officers who had earned the privilege. The most valuable captives, the kings and queens who would be the centerpieces of the triumph, received special treatment. They were kept separate from common prisoners. They were fed adequately and housed in conditions that prevented disease and disfigurement. Their bodies were maintained in conditions suitable for public display, but their minds were considered fair targets for whatever attention their captors wished to provide. A queen, who arrived in Rome too broken to walk, would be useless. A queen who arrived still defiant, still proud, still displaying the royal dignity that had characterized her reign, would fail to demonstrate Roman dominance. The ideal captive was someone visibly royal, but visibly defeated. Someone whose bearing showed that they had been a monarch, but whose eyes showed that they understood they were now property. Achieving this balance required expertise. It required time. It required the 8 months between capture and triumph that Berenice was about to experience. And it required men who understood how to break royalty without destroying them. The general's tent was larger than the house Berenice had grown up in before she became queen. Silk hangings covered the canvas walls. Carpets from Persia cushioned the floor. Furniture that would not have been out of place in a Roman senator's villa was arranged around a central space where braziers burned sweet-smelling wood despite the morning warmth. Gaius Germanicus Julius Caesar sat behind a desk covered with maps and dispatches, the morning light from an opened tent flap, illuminating features that Berenice had seen on coins and statues throughout the eastern Mediterranean. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 35, with the athletic build of someone who had spent his life on campaign. His expression was intelligent, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "The Queen of Cappadocia," he said. His voice was pleasant, cultivated, the voice of a man raised in the highest circles of Roman society. "I have been looking forward to meeting you. Your resistance cost me 2 years and 11,000 soldiers. That is not something I forget." "I was defending my kingdom," Berenice replied. "You were invading it. We both did what our positions required. Your kingdom no longer exists. Cappadocia is now a Roman province. Your nobles are dead or enslaved. Your army is destroyed. Your treasury is packed in wagons for transport to Rome. Everything you were, everything you represented, has been erased from the world." He paused, letting the words settle. "Except you. You kept me alive for the triumph. I kept you alive because you are the most valuable thing I captured in 7 years of war. A queen who defied Rome for nearly a decade, who killed a legate's nephew, who made speeches comparing herself to Boudica and promising to drive the legions into the sea. When you walk in my triumph, chained and broken, everyone in Rome will understand what I have accomplished. And after the triumph?" Germanicus smiled. It was the smile of a man discussing an interesting problem, not a human life. "That depends on many factors. Your behavior during the coming months, your value as a political symbol, your usefulness for other purposes." He gestured, and a servant appeared with wine. The general drank without offering any to Berenice. "You should understand something about your situation. You are no longer a queen. You are no longer a person, in Roman legal terms. You are property of the Roman state, temporarily assigned to my custody until the triumph is completed. I understand. I do not think you do. Not yet." Germanicus set down his wine cup and studied her with an attention that made her skin crawl. "The journey to Rome takes approximately 6 months. During that time, you will travel with my command staff. You will be housed in conditions appropriate to your status as a valuable captive. You will be fed adequately, clothed appropriately, maintained in conditions suitable for display. That sounds reasonable. It does, doesn't it? But there are other aspects of your captivity that I have not yet mentioned. Aspects that concern your role during those 6 months beyond simply existing as cargo." He rose from behind the desk and approached her. The guard who had been holding her arm stepped back, leaving her standing alone before the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman Empire. "You cost me 2 years," Germanicus said. "You cost me 11,000 soldiers. You cost me the life of a man whose family has influence in the Senate. These are debts, and I believe in paying debts. What do you want from me? For now, I want you to understand that your situation is entirely within my control, that your survival until the triumph is not guaranteed, merely likely if you prove cooperative, that there are many ways this captivity can proceed, some more painful than others, and that you will determine which path we take by your behavior." He was close enough now that she could smell his breath, wine, and something underneath that might have been the cinnamon Romans used to freshen their mouths. His hand rose and touched her face, a gentle gesture that carried absolute threat. "Tonight, you will dine with my officers," he said. "You will be dressed appropriately, presented appropriately, and you will behave appropriately. This dinner will be an opportunity for you to demonstrate your understanding of your new position. Do you understand?" Berenice understood. She understood exactly what dinner with Roman officers would involve for a captive queen with no protections and no recourse. "I understand," she said. "Good." Germanicus stepped back. The moment of intimacy concluded. "You will be assigned a minder, a centurion named Marcus Cornelius. He will be responsible for your care and preparation. He will explain the details of what is expected from you. Obey him as you would obey me." A guard led her from the tent. Behind her, she heard Germanicus already dictating a letter, her existence already forgotten as he moved on to other business. She was a possession, a trophy, a prop for someone else's glory. And tonight, She would learn what that meant in practice. The centurion Marcus Cornelius was not what Berenice expected. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered face and scarred hands of a career soldier, but his eyes held something that the other Romans she had encountered lacked. Not kindness, exactly. Something more complicated. Awareness, perhaps. Recognition that the prisoner in front of him was a human being, rather than merely a category. He met her in a smaller tent that had been designated as her quarters, furnished with a cot, a basin of water, and a chest that contained clothing she did not want to examine yet. "You are Berenice of Cappadocia," he said. "I am Marcus Cornelius. I have been assigned responsibility for your preparation." Preparation for what exactly? Marcus looked at her for a long moment before answering. The official answer is preparation for the triumph. Ensuring you remain healthy, presentable, and capable of walking the required distance through Rome. The unofficial answer is more complicated. Tell me the complicated answer. The general and his officers believe they have earned access to you. They believe that the conquest of your kingdom entitles them to your person, as well as your treasury. During the journey to Rome, you will be expected to provide hospitality at various official functions. He said the word hospitality with a precision that made clear he was using it as a euphemism, that both of them understood what it actually meant. And if I refuse, there is a man named Gaius Varro. He is a prefect who specializes in managing valuable captives. His methods are effective at producing compliance. They are also damaging, sometimes permanently. The general prefers to preserve your value for the triumph. But if you prove uncooperative, Varro will be given authority over your preparation. What are his methods? Marcus was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Varro believes that royal captives need to be taught their new status through direct experience. He uses techniques designed to break resistance quickly. The captives he prepares rarely survive long after the triumph. Those who do survive are not themselves afterward. And you? Berenice asked. What are your methods? I prefer captives who survive. I prefer cooperation achieved through understanding rather than destruction. I explain the situation honestly, outline the options available, and allow the captive to make informed choices. He met her eyes directly. You have no good options. Everything available to you is terrible. But some options are less terrible than others. Choosing wisely may allow you to preserve something of yourself through what is coming. This was more honesty than Berenice had expected from any Roman. It was also more dangerous, in its way. A captor who saw her as human was one she might influence. A captor who admitted complexity in the situation was one she might manipulate. She filed this information away, another weapon in the small arsenal she was building. What do you recommend? She asked. Cooperate at the dinners. Endure what the officers require. Do not resist in ways that trigger Varro's involvement. Preserve your health, your sanity, and your will to survive until the triumph. After the triumph, other possibilities may exist. What possibilities? Some captive royalty have survived their triumphs. Some have been permitted to live in comfortable exile. Some have even been restored to client status, ruling their former territories as Roman puppets. These outcomes are rare, but they exist. If you can remain valuable to Rome in some way beyond the triumph itself, you may have a future. A future. The word seemed almost absurd in her current situation, but Marcus spoke it as if it were real, as if planning for a future beyond captivity were not merely delusion. Why are you telling me this? Berenice asked. Why explain options to a prisoner you're supposed to be preparing for humiliation? Marcus did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something she had not heard before. I have been doing this work for 15 years. I have prepared 17 royal captives for triumphs. 11 of them died within a year of their procession through Rome. 4 of them killed themselves before the triumph could occur. 2 of them survived to live something resembling lives afterward. Which do you want me to be? I want you to be the third who survives. Not because I have any particular affection for you, but because I am tired of watching people destroy themselves or be destroyed when other outcomes were possible. He turned toward the tent flap, then paused. The dinner tonight will be difficult. What happens after the dinner will be worse. But if you can endure it, if you can find a way through the next 8 months without breaking completely, you may emerge from this alive. That is worth something. That is worth enduring considerable horror to achieve. He left her alone with the clothing and the chest, and the knowledge of what the evening would bring. Now I need to tell you something about the Roman triumph that the standard histories omit. The captives who walked in triumphs were not simply collected and transported. They were processed through a system designed to produce specific outcomes. This system had developed over centuries as Rome conquered territory from Britain to Parthia, processing millions of prisoners and refining its methods with each new conquest. The processing had 3 primary phases. The first phase was capture and initial assessment. During this period, prisoners were sorted according to value. Common soldiers became slaves. Officers might be executed, ransomed, or retained for the triumph depending on their status. Royalty was always retained, their value too great to waste on immediate disposal. The second phase was preparation. This lasted from capture until arrival in Rome, typically 3 to 12 months, depending on the distance traveled. During preparation, royal captives were maintained in physical condition while being systematically broken psychologically. The goal was to produce prisoners who could walk and stand and respond appropriately to commands while having lost all capacity for resistance or hope. The third phase was display and disposal. The triumph itself lasted a single day, but the logistics required weeks of preparation in Rome. Captives were housed in the Tullianum, the ancient prison beneath the Roman Forum, or in temporary facilities constructed for the purpose. After the triumph, their fate was determined by political calculation, execution for those who posed continued threat, exile for those who might be useful, sometimes release into Roman society for those whose cooperation had been thorough enough. The preparation phase was where the real destruction occurred. Roman officers who had conquered territory believed they had earned rewards. The general received the triumph itself, the glory and political benefits that would advance his career. The legions received bonuses from captured treasury. The officers, particularly the senior staff, who had made strategic decisions, received something else. They received access. The euphemism used in Roman sources is hospitium, hospitality, the word that Marcus employed when explaining Berenice's situation. It appears in military records as a category of expense, costs associated with providing appropriate hospitality during the preparation of important captives. Modern scholars have generally interpreted this as referring to food and housing, the practical requirements of maintaining prisoners during long journeys. But other sources, less often cited, make clear what hospitality actually meant. Captured royalty, particularly captured queens and princesses, were expected to provide personal service to the officers who had conquered them. This service began with dinner attendance, progressed through what the sources call entertainment, and culminated in private sessions that the records do not describe directly, but that left unmistakable traces in the pregnancy records and disease reports that survive in military archives. The service was not optional. Refusal triggered escalation to specialists like the Gaius Varro that Marcus described, men whose methods produced compliance at the cost of the captive's long-term survival. Most captive royalty learned quickly that cooperation, however degrading, was preferable to the alternative. But some resisted, and the records of what happened to those who resisted reveal the true nature of Roman captive management. There was a Carthaginian princess in 146 BCE who refused service and was given to the common soldiers of the third cohort. There was a Macedonian queen in 167 BCE who attempted escape and was subjected to public punishment that lasted 3 days. There was a Numidian prince who fought back during a service session and was castrated, then kept alive for the triumph as a eunuch whose mutilation would be displayed alongside his defeat. These examples were not hidden. They were publicized, deliberately, as warnings to other captives about the consequences of non-cooperation. They were part of the system, the stick that complemented the carrot of survival. This was what Berenice faced as she dressed for dinner in garments selected by Romans to display her as a trophy, as she prepared to provide hospitality to the officers who had destroyed her kingdom. She understood now what Marcus meant about options. She understood that every choice available to her was terrible, and she understood that survival required choosing the least terrible option and finding a way to endure whatever it cost. The dinner was held in Germanicus's command tent, the same space where Berenice had been informed of her status that morning. But the tent had been transformed. The maps and dispatches were gone, replaced by dining couches arranged around a central space where servants moved with practiced efficiency. Torches lit the interior with golden light that softened faces and concealed expressions. 12 officers reclined on the couches, Germanicus at the position of honor, his senior commanders arranged according to rank. They wore civilian dress rather than armor, an affectation designed to create the illusion that this was a civilized gathering rather than a military function. Berenice had been dressed in a gown that left little to imagination, sheer fabric in the Greek style that the Romans associated with conquered Eastern peoples. Her stubbled hair was covered by a wig in the elaborate style that Roman women wore, the artificiality somehow more humiliating than simple baldness would have been. Gold chains circled her wrists and ankles, decorative rather than functional, symbols of status rather than actual restraints. She was presented like a dish, another course in the evening's entertainment. The Queen of Cappadocia, Germanicus announced as she was led into the space. My gift to you for your service in the Eastern campaign. Gift. The word made clear what was expected. She was being given to these men, distributed among them like the other plunder of the conquest. The officers studied her with the assessing gaze she had already learned to recognize. Some looked appreciative, some looked cruel. One, a thin man with calculating eyes, whom she would later learn was Gaius Varro, looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She is well preserved, one of the officers commented. The campaign was hard on the other royal captives. She is valuable, Germanicus replied. The triumph requires her in acceptable condition, but acceptable condition leaves considerable room for use. Laughter rippled through the gathering. Berenice stood motionless, her face carefully neutral, her mind racing through the situation and finding no escape. Let her serve the wine, Varro suggested. A queen serving Roman officers, an appropriate demonstration of her new status. Germanicus nodded approval. A servant pressed a wine pitcher into Berenice's hands and gestured toward the couches. She served. She moved among the officers, filling cups, enduring hands that found reasons to touch her as she leaned to pour. She kept her face empty, her movements precise, her awareness focused entirely on cataloging information. Who held power, who sought power, who might be useful, who was dangerous. Varro was dangerous. His eyes tracked her constantly, and when she came to fill his cup, his hand closed on her wrist with pressure that promised pain. You are resistant, he said quietly, pitched for her ears alone. I can see it in your posture. You have not accepted your situation. You still believe you might escape, might somehow retain your dignity. I am cooperating, Berenice replied. I am serving as instructed. Your body is cooperating. Your mind is elsewhere. That is a problem I know how to solve. The general wishes me preserved for the triumph. The general wishes you broken for the triumph. The question is merely method. I prefer my methods, but I am patient. Eventually, you will provide the opportunity I am waiting for. He released her wrist. The marks of his fingers would be visible for days. The dinner continued. As the wine flowed and the officers grew louder, the entertainment shifted. Musicians performed, dancers appeared. And then, as the evening reached its inevitable conclusion, the officers began making requests. The first officer who took Berenice to a private section of the tent was not cruel, merely efficient. He was finished quickly and returned her to the central space without comment. The second was slower, more interested in her reactions than her body, asking questions about her kingdom while he used her. The third left bruises that would not show beneath her clothing. By the time the evening ended, 4 officers had claimed their portion of the victory. Berenice had experienced exactly what Marcus had warned her about, and she had survived it. She was returned to her tent, to the basin of water and the narrow cot, to the solitude where she could finally allow herself to feel what she had been suppressing for hours. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry until she was free, until tears could be an expression of relief rather than defeat. But she allowed herself to plan. Marcus appeared the next morning with breakfast and a physician. The physician examined her professionally, checking for injuries, applying salve to the bruises, asking questions about pain and bleeding that Berenice answered with the same clinical detachment. She is intact, the physician reported to Marcus. Minor damage, nothing that will affect her presentation. She should be fit for service again within 2 days. Service. Another euphemism. Berenice was learning the vocabulary of her captivity, the civilized language Romans used to describe uncivilized things. When the physician left, Marcus sat down on the chest that contained her clothing and studied her with an expression she could not read. You survived, he said. Was there doubt? There is always doubt. Some women break during the first dinner. They resist, they fight, they trigger responses that damage them beyond repair. You did not. I am not interested in being damaged beyond repair. I am interested in surviving. Good. Survival requires strategy. Do you have a strategy? Berenice considered the question. She had been forming a strategy since the moment of her capture, but she had not spoken it aloud. Speaking it would make it real, would commit her to a course of action that might be impossible. But Marcus had been honest with her. He had explained her situation without deception. Perhaps honesty deserved honesty in return. Germanicus wants me broken for the triumph, she said. But he also wants me recognizable as a queen. Too much breaking and I become useless. Not enough, and I fail to demonstrate his victory. That is accurate. My strategy is to appear to break while remaining intact inside, to give him what he needs for the triumph, while preserving enough of myself to have a future afterward. Marcus nodded slowly. That is a difficult balance. Many have attempted it. Most have failed. What made the failures fail? They could not maintain the pretense. The horror accumulated faster than their ability to process it. They either broke genuinely, or they revealed their resistance and triggered escalation. What made the successes succeed? They found something to hold on to, some reason to survive beyond mere survival, a purpose that sustained them through experiences that should have destroyed them. What kind of purpose? It varies. Some focused on revenge, though revenge from captivity is rarely possible. Some focused on children, though the children of captive queens often fare poorly. Some focused on preserving something knowledge, traditions, stories that would otherwise be lost. Berenice thought about her kingdom, now a Roman province, her nobles, dead or enslaved, her treasury, packed in wagons, her culture, already being erased by Roman administrators who would rename her cities and replace her temples. My kingdom is gone, she said. My children are dead. My son was killed in the siege. My daughter was taken, and I do not know where. I have no revenge to take, no legacy to preserve, nothing except myself. Then you must find something else. Marcus rose from the chest. You have time. The journey to Rome takes 6 months. During that time, you will endure dinners like last night, perhaps once per week. Between dinners, you will travel, you will observe, you will think. Use that time to find your purpose. And if I cannot find one, then you will break, eventually. Not today, not tomorrow, but somewhere during the months ahead. The weight becomes too heavy if there is nothing to carry it for. He left her with that warning and the remains of her breakfast. She ate mechanically, her mind working through the problem he had posed. She needed a purpose. She needed something worth surviving for. She did not have one, not yet. But she had 6 months to find one. The journey west began 3 days after the dinner. The army moved in disciplined columns, thousands of soldiers, hundreds of wagons, and a train of captives that stretched for nearly a mile. Berenice traveled in a covered wagon that offered protection from sun and rain while reminding her constantly that she was cargo. The wagon was comfortable by military standards, cushions to sit on, canvas walls that provided privacy, water and food available, but it was still a prison on wheels, moving inexorably toward Rome. She was not alone in the wagon. 3 other captives shared the space, 2 women from Cappadocian noble families, and a girl of perhaps 12 who had been a princess before the conquest. They had all survived the first dinners, all learned the vocabulary of survival that captivity required. The older women were already broken in the ways that mattered. They complied without resistance, served without complaint, spoke of the future as if it were a foreign country they would never visit. They had accepted their status, internalized it, become what Rome wanted them to be. The girl, whose name was Ariadne, was different. She watched everything with eyes that missed nothing, remembered everything, calculated constantly. She reminded Berenice of herself at that age, before she became queen, before she learned to hide her intelligence behind appropriate feminine modesty. You are planning something, Ariadne said one afternoon, when the older women were sleeping and the wagon's motion had settled into a steady rhythm. What makes you think that? You look at everything like you are memorizing it, the guards' schedules, the positions of the wagons, which officers have authority over which prisoners. You are collecting information. Berenice considered denying it, but the girl was perceptive, and deception would only teach her not to trust, which might damage her chances of survival. I am collecting information, Berenice admitted. I do not yet know what I will do with it, but information is the only resource I have, so I gather it. Can I help? What do you know how to do? I know how to listen. Soldiers talk around me like I am furniture. They say things they would not say if they remembered I could understand Latin. What kind of things? One of the centurions is stealing from the baggage train. Another is having an affair with the general's secretary. A third has gambling debts that he cannot pay. Ariadne listed the information with precision. I do not know if any of it is useful, but I have been collecting it, like you. Berenice felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel again. This girl was smart, observant, potentially valuable. She was also young and vulnerable, and likely to be destroyed by what awaited her in Rome. Perhaps that was the purpose Marcus had told her to find. Not survival for its own sake, but survival for someone else's sake. Protecting this girl who reminded her of herself, who had the same intelligence and determination, who might have a future if someone helped her navigate the coming horror. Keep collecting, Berenice said. Tell me what you learn. Together, we may be able to use it. Ariadne nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. What are we trying to achieve? I do not know yet, but I am starting to believe we might achieve something. It was not much of a purpose. It was barely the beginning of a plan, but it was something to hold on to, something worth surviving for. For the first time since her capture, Berenice felt something that might have been hope. The journey continued. The dinners continued. The systematic exploitation of captive royalty continued. Each event another horror to be endured, another night to survive, another step toward a future that might or might not exist. Berenice learned the officers' names, their preferences, their weaknesses. She learned who was ambitious and who was satisfied, who resented Germanicus and who worshipped him, who might be useful and who was simply dangerous. Gaius Varro remained the greatest danger. He watched her constantly, waited for any sign of resistance that would justify transferring her to his authority. She gave him nothing, performed her required service without complaint, maintained the appearance of submission that kept him at bay. But she was not submitting. She was observing, planning, building a map of the social terrain she would need to navigate. Marcus continued his role as her minder, their conversations becoming longer as the journey progressed. He told her about his family in Italy, a wife and 2 sons he had not seen in 3 years. He told her about his career, 20 years of military service that had taught him everything about the Roman system and left him deeply ambivalent about what he had participated in. "Why do you do this work?" Berenice asked one evening, 3 months into the journey. "If you have doubts about it, why continue? Because the work will be done regardless. If not by me, then by someone like Varro, who would do it with enthusiasm rather than ambivalence. At least with me, some captives survive. At least with me, there is someone who sees them as human. That is not much comfort. It is not meant to be comfort. It is meant to be honest. I cannot change the system. I can only operate within it in ways that reduce harm at the margins. Have you ever helped a captive escape?" The question hung between them. Marcus was silent for a long moment before answering. No, escape from a triumph procession is essentially impossible. The captives are too closely guarded, the journey too long, the destination too well secured. Those who have attempted it have been captured and subjected to punishments that made their previous treatment seem gentle. But if it were possible, he looked at her with an expression she could not read. If it were possible, I would have to weigh my loyalty to Rome against my humanity. I do not know which would win. Berenice filed this information away. Marcus was not an ally, not yet. But he was a potential ally, someone who might choose humanity over loyalty if the circumstances were right. Creating those circumstances became part of her planning. 5 months into the journey, they reached the Italian peninsula. The army paused at a major port city to resupply and reorganize for the final march to Rome. During this pause, Berenice received a visitor she had not expected. A woman came to her wagon, escorted by guards, but carrying herself with authority that suggested she was not a prisoner. She was perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of Roman aristocracy, and the sharp eyes of someone who had survived decades of political maneuvering. "I am Antonia Minor," the woman said, "mother of Germanicus. I wish to see the Cappadocian queen before the triumph." Berenice had heard of Antonia, daughter of Mark Antony, niece of the divine Augustus, one of the most powerful women in Rome, despite holding no official position. Her visit was unexpected and potentially significant. "You honor me with your presence," Berenice said, deploying the formal courtesy that royalty used with equals. Treating Antonia as an equal was a gamble, but it was also a statement about how Berenice still saw herself. Antonia smiled slightly, acknowledging the gambit. "You are well spoken for someone in your position. My son's reports suggested a barbarian queen. I see instead an educated woman who understands politics. Cappadocia was not barbarous. We had libraries, theaters, temples. We were heirs to Greek and Persian civilization. Rome destroyed us, not because we were inferior, but because we were in your way. A fair assessment." Antonia seated herself on the wagon's bench, ignoring the impropriety of a Roman noblewoman sitting with a captive. "I am curious about something. My son writes that you have been cooperative during your captivity. But his officers report that you have not broken as expected. You comply, but you do not submit. This interests me. Should I have submitted? Most do. The methods are effective. By this point in the journey, most captive royalty are hollow shells, going through motions without internal resistance. You are different. Why? Berenice considered the question. Antonia was either an opportunity or a danger, perhaps both. But she sensed that honesty might serve better than deception. I am surviving for someone else's sake, she said. There is a girl among the captives, 12 years old, intelligent, capable of having a future if someone helps her. I'm trying to be that someone. Antonia's expression shifted subtly. You found a purpose. I was told I needed one. Whoever told you that was wise. Antonia rose from the bench. I will remember what you have said. After the triumph, there may be opportunities for captives who have demonstrated value beyond their symbolic function. A woman who can educate and guide a child might have uses that a broken slave does not. She left without further explanation, leaving Berenice to wonder what had just happened and what it might mean for her future. The final month of the journey was the hardest. As the procession approached Rome, the atmosphere intensified. The triumph was near, the culmination of years of planning and conquest, and everyone involved felt the pressure. Germanicus became more demanding, his officers more aggressive, the dinners more frequent and more degrading. Berenice endured it. She had endured worse in the early months when she did not know what to expect. Now she had techniques, mental strategies that allowed her to separate her awareness from her body, to experience what happened to her from a distance. She also had Ariadne, who continued collecting information and sharing it in their whispered conversations. The girl had become something like a daughter, a responsibility that gave Berenice's survival meaning beyond mere continuation. And she had Marcus, whose conversations had become the closest thing to human connection she experienced. He had not become an ally in the active sense, had not offered to help her escape or resist. But he had become someone who saw her as a person, who talked to her about subjects beyond her captivity, who treated her as if she might have a future worth discussing. 1 week before the triumph, he told her something that changed everything. Germanicus has received instructions from Tiberius, Marcus said. The emperor has decided that you will not be executed after the triumph. Not executed? Tiberius sees value in keeping you alive. Cappadocia has been restless under Roman rule. A former queen who has been seen to accept Roman authority, who lives comfortably in Rome as evidence that submission is rewarded, might be useful for pacifying continued resistance. I would be a symbol, a demonstration that collaboration is better than resistance. Yes, you would live in a comfortable household, probably with one of the senatorial families who support the emperor. You would be expected to write letters to former subjects, encouraging them to accept Roman rule. You would be, essentially, a propaganda instrument. Berenice processed this information. Survival was possible. More than possible, it was planned. But the price was becoming a tool of Roman imperialism, helping to destroy what remained of her kingdom's resistance. What happens if I refuse? Then you are no longer valuable alive. The execution after the triumph becomes the default option. And Ariadne, the other captives? The child may be sold as a slave or given to a household as a servant. The other women will likely face the same. Their fates are not significant enough for imperial attention. Berenice understood the choice she was being offered. Collaborate and live, refuse and die. Save herself by abandoning everyone she had come to care about. What if I could offer something more valuable than propaganda? She asked. Marcus looked at her sharply. What do you mean? I know things about Cappadocia that Roman administrators do not. The locations of hidden treasuries that were not found during the conquest. The names of underground resistance leaders. the internal politics of families that are pretending submission while planning rebellion. I could provide intelligence that would make the province easier to govern. That would make you a traitor to your own people. I am already a traitor. I survive by providing service to the officers who conquered me. The question is not whether I betray my people, but what I receive in return for the betrayal. What do you want? I want Ariadne. I want the right to keep her with me, to educate her, to prepare her for a future that does not involve slavery. I want the other women from my wagon to be given to households where they will be treated adequately rather than sold to the highest bidder. And I want some small degree of autonomy over my own existence. Marcus was silent for a long moment. I cannot promise any of this. I can only bring your proposal to people who have authority. Then bring it. Tell them that the Cappadocian queen is willing to become a Roman asset, but that she has conditions. See what they say. He left to make inquiries. Berenice sat alone in her wagon, wondering if she had just guaranteed her survival or signed her death warrant. The triumph began at dawn on the 3rd day of September. Berenice had been prepared by specialists who understood exactly how a captured queen should be presented. Her hair, grown back to a few inches during the journey, was styled in the elaborate fashion of her former kingdom. Her clothing was the royal regalia of Cappadocia, preserved from the looting for this specific purpose. Gold chains draped her neck and wrists, heavier than the decorative restraints she had worn during the journey, symbols of captivity designed to be visible to the crowds. She walked in the procession between wagons of plunder and cohorts of soldiers, a living trophy among the inanimate ones. Around her, the streets of Rome were lined with citizens who had come to celebrate Germanicus's victory, to cheer the soldiers and jeer the captives, to participate in the spectacle that made Roman imperialism visible and visceral. The walk was long. The route wound through the city from the Campus Martius to the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, a distance that took hours to cover at the procession's formal pace. Berenice's feet ached. Her body protested, but she kept walking. She kept her head high. This was not defiance, exactly. She had been instructed to walk with dignity, to be recognizable as a queen, so that her defeat would be meaningful. But she chose to interpret the instruction broadly, to display the bearing of royalty without displaying the brokenness the Romans expected. The crowds noticed. She heard comments as she passed, surprised that the Cappadocian queen looked like a monarch rather than a victim. Some jeered louder, trying to provoke a reaction. Others fell silent, recognizing something in her posture that did not fit the narrative they expected. Near the forum, she saw Antonia Minor watching from a balcony. Their eyes met briefly. Antonia nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that no one else would have noticed. At the Temple of Jupiter, the procession paused. This was where the captive's fate would be determined, where kings and queens were traditionally executed as offerings to the god who had granted Rome victory. Berenice waited. Germanicus ascended the temple steps, his face painted red like Jupiter's image, his toga purple and gold like an emperor's. He made sacrifices, received the cheers of the crowd, delivered a speech about Roman glory and the defeat of Rome's enemies. Then he turned to the captives. The Queen of Cappadocia has demonstrated her acceptance of Roman authority, he announced. She has offered to serve Rome's interests in her former territory. The emperor, in his wisdom and mercy, has decreed that she shall live. The crowd murmured, surprised by mercy in a ritual that usually ended in execution. She will be placed in the household of Antonia Minor, my mother, where she will serve as evidence that Rome rewards submission as it punishes resistance. Her cooperation in the administration of Cappadocia will be an example to all who consider defying Roman power. It was done. She had survived. The soldiers led her away from the temple, away from the crowd, away from the spectacle. Behind her, other captives were not so fortunate. She heard cheers that indicated executions were proceeding as planned for those who had not found ways to make themselves valuable. But she was alive. And somewhere in the crowd, Ariadne was watching, waiting to learn if Berenice's promises could be kept. The household of Antonia Minor was not what Berenice expected. It was comfortable, certainly. A villa on the Palatine Hill, staffed by slaves and freedmen who treated her with a deference due to an honored guest rather than a conquered enemy. She had her own rooms, her own servants, her own small degree of autonomy within the larger structure of captivity. But it was also a political operation. Antonia used Berenice's knowledge of Cappadocia to influence Roman policy toward the province. The intelligence Berenice provided about hidden treasuries and resistance networks was acted upon, Roman soldiers arriving at locations Berenice had identified to seize assets and arrest leaders. Her betrayal was systematic, thorough, and impossible to deny. She told herself she had no choice. She told herself she was trading lesser evils for greater goods. She told herself that the people she was betraying would have been found eventually, that her information only accelerated an inevitable process. She did not entirely believe herself, but she kept Ariadne. The girl lived in her quarters, was educated by tutors Berenice selected, was prepared for a future that did not involve servitude. Antonia had kept that promise, recognizing that Berenice's cooperation was more reliable when she had something to protect. The other women from the wagon fared adequately. They were placed in households where Antonia had influence, treated as servants rather than slaves, given work that was hard but not degrading. It was not freedom, but it was survival. Marcus Cornelius visited occasionally. His military duties had ended with the triumph, and he had returned to his family in Italy, but he found reasons to come to Rome, to check on the captive he had shepherded through months of horror. "You survived," he said during one of these visits, the words echoing what he had said after her first dinner with the officers. "I survived. Is that enough? That depends on what you do with survival. Some survivors become hollow, living without purpose now that the crisis has passed. Others find new purposes, new reasons to continue. Which are you?" Berenice looked at Ariadne, who was studying Greek in a corner of the room, her concentration fierce and her progress remarkable. "I am trying to be the second kind," she said. "I am trying to find purposes that justify what I have done to survive. And are you finding them? I am raising a girl who will grow up educated, capable, free in ways that I will never be. I am preserving knowledge of my kingdom that would otherwise be lost, writing histories that Romans will dismiss but that future generations might discover. I am living, and as long as I am living, I can do things that the dead cannot." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is more than most survivors achieve. It is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is what is possible, and I have learned to work with what is possible, rather than mourning what is not." He stayed for dinner that night, the first time she had shared a meal with a Roman man without the expectation of service afterward. They talked about philosophy, about history, about the futures they might have had in a different world. It was almost like friendship, almost like the human connection that captivity had stripped away. When he left, Berenice returned to her writing, preserving another fragment of Cappadocian history before it was forgotten entirely. The years passed. Ariadne grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and determination. At 16, she was freed by Antonia, who recognized that an educated freedwoman was more valuable than an enslaved girl. At 18, she married a Greek merchant who treated her as an equal, who valued her mind as much as her beauty. At 20, she had children of her own, children who would grow up free, who would never know what their grandmother had endured to make their existence possible. Berenice watched all of this with satisfaction that did not quite dispel her grief. She had saved one girl. She had betrayed a kingdom. The mathematics of survival did not balance easily. Antonia died in 37 CE, and Berenice's status became uncertain. She was not a slave. Antonia had freed her years earlier as a reward for continued cooperation, but she was not truly free either. She was a former queen living in Rome, on the sufferance of the imperial system, dependent on patrons who valued her historical knowledge and diplomatic connections. She wrote letters to Ariadne's children, teaching them what she remembered of Cappadocian history and culture. She corresponded with scholars who were interested in the eastern provinces, providing information that would later appear in works by historians whose names would survive while hers was forgotten. She lived quietly, obscurely, a remnant of a world that Rome had destroyed. Marcus visited when he could. He had retired from the legions after 30 years of service, settled on a farm in Campania, become the kind of peaceable old man that his younger self would have despised. But he remembered the Cappadocian queen who had survived when survival seemed impossible, and he made time to see her. "Do you regret it?" he asked during one of their final conversations, when they were both old, and death was no longer a distant abstraction. "Regret what? Surviving?" "The choices you made to survive, the betrayals, the collaboration, the transformation from queen to informant, to symbol of submission." Berenice considered the question. She had asked it of herself many times over the decades, never reaching a satisfactory answer. "I regret that I had to make those choices," she said finally. "I regret that the world is structured so that survival requires betrayal, so that protecting one person means abandoning others. But do I regret choosing survival over death, life over principle? No, I do not. Even knowing what it cost? Even knowing. Because Ariadne is alive, and her children are alive, and something of Cappadocia survives in the stories I have preserved, and the traditions I have passed on. If I had died in the triumph, if I had chosen principle over survival, none of that would exist. The dead do not write histories, or raise children, or preserve what would otherwise be lost." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think you made the right choice, for whatever my judgment is worth." "Your judgment is worth more than you know. You saw me as human when others saw only a trophy. You helped me find purpose when I had lost everything else. I survived, partly because you showed me survival was possible." They sat in silence for a while, two old people who had witnessed the machinery of empire from different positions, who had found ways to remain human despite what they had participated in. "Will you be remembered?" Marcus asked. "No, not by name. The histories will mention the Cappadocian queen who walked in Germanicus's triumph, but they will not record what happened to her afterward. I will disappear from the record, as I disappeared from public life. That seems unjust. Justice has nothing to do with history. History remembers the powerful and forgets their victims. But somewhere, in copies of my writings, in the memories of Ariadne's descendants, in the fragments that survive when empires fall, something of me will remain. Something of Cappadocia will remain. That is all I can hope for. That is enough." She died 2 years later, in her sleep, in the villa that Ariadne had bought for her with money earned through the merchant business. Ariadne buried her, according to Cappadocian custom, with rituals that Romans did not recognize and traditions that had almost been forgotten. The grave marker did not identify her as a queen. It simply said, "Berenice." She survived. What you have learned tonight is not the story that Roman historians told. They celebrated the triumph as a glorious expression of Roman power, documenting the plunder and the captives, and the general's magnificently painted face. They mentioned the Cappadocian queen in passing, noted that she was preserved rather than executed, moved on to other subjects. They did not describe the dinners, the hospitality, the months of systematic exploitation that preceded the public spectacle. They did not document the choices captive royalty faced, the bargains they made, the pieces of themselves they sacrificed to survive. But the evidence exists for those who look for it. Military expense reports that include suspicious categories, medical records that document injuries and pregnancies, private letters that describe entertainment in terms too vague to be innocent. The traces of what happened to captive queens before the Triumph Parade survive in archives that scholars have traditionally chosen not to examine closely. The Romans were not unique in their treatment of captured royalty. Every conquering power in history has faced the question of what to do with defeated monarchs, and most have answered that question with various forms of systematic destruction. What made Rome distinctive was the institutionalization of this destruction, the development of protocols and procedures and specialists who transformed individual cruelty into bureaucratic process. Berenice survived this process because she understood it, analyzed it, found ways to work within it. She was not passive. She was not merely lucky. She was intelligent, observant, and willing to make choices that others might consider unforgivable in order to continue existing. Some would call her collaboration treason. Some would call her survival cowardice. Some would say that death with dignity would have been preferable to life with compromise. But she lived. She raised a girl who became a woman. She preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. She found purposes that made survival meaningful rather than merely biological. And she left a record, fragments preserved in archives and traditions passed through generations, that allows us to know that the triumph was not the whole story, that what happened before the triumph was worse than what happened during it, that the queens who walked in chains through Rome had already endured horrors that the cheering crowds never saw and the heroic histories never mentioned. Remember Berenice. Remember the Cappadocian queen who survived when survival seemed impossible. Remember that she walked through the streets of Rome with her head held high, not because she had not been broken, but because she had put herself back together from the broken pieces. Remember that survival is not the same as victory, but it is not defeat either. It is something else, something more complicated, something that requires choices that cannot be easily judged by those who have never faced them. Remember the other women who did not survive, whose names are lost, whose stories ended in the cells beneath Rome, or on the altars of Jupiter, or in the slow destruction of the journey west. They deserved better. They all deserved better. Remember that the Roman triumph, celebrated for centuries as the pinnacle of military glory, was built on the systematic destruction of human beings who had committed no crime except living in territories Rome wanted to control. The golden chariots and cheering crowds and triumphant generals all rested on a foundation of suffering that the official histories chose to forget. Remember that choosing survival is not weakness, that compromising to live is not cowardice, that those who endure horrific circumstances and find ways to remain human deserve recognition, not judgment. Remember Berenice, writing her histories in a Roman villa, raising a girl who would have children of her own, preserving what could be preserved of a world that Rome destroyed. She survived, and sometimes surviving is its own form of victory. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the Roman triumph from what they learned about military glory and public celebration. Because the triumph was not only the parade and the plunder and the painted face of the general, it was also Berenice, walking in chains through streets that jeered her, arriving at a temple where she expected to die, discovering that she would live, but that living would require bargains she had never imagined making. It was also the months before the parade, the dinners and the hospitality and the systematic destruction that prepared captive royalty for their moment of public display. It was also the years after, the quiet survival in Roman households, the preservation of fragments, the raising of children, who would never know what their existence had cost.